Okay. What up, TCK Potters? Welcome back to the program. I'm your host, Sky Guasco, with my man, Bobby Lamarco. We got a quick hitter for you. This is going to be a new series on the TCK Pod. We're going to make it short and sweet. I'm going to explain this one because it's the first one, but after that, we're going to get right into the knowledge for you, and we're going to get crushing out some of these mini videos right here on the YouTube channel, Fantasy Focused on YouTube. Make sure to subscribe. Hit us up on Twitch, Facebook, and Twitter as well. In just a few moments, Bob's going to lay down 2020 version of Jonathan Taylor. We're talking Jonathan Taylor specifically for this particular show, and then we'll move on to Austin Eckler coming up next and so forth. Right now in this mini series, we're talking about running back steals. Those are players that exceedingly, exploded on their expectation from preseason average draft position, right? These are the guys that we're excited about. And we're going to try to tell you how to find steals moving forward for the 2022 draft. So guys like Elijah Mitchell, Devin Singletary, Cordero Patterson don't necessarily come out of nowhere, and you can plan ahead and find those guys in the cracks. So this is going to be a mini series. This is not available on the podcast. You can only find these on the YouTube channel. So make sure you subscribe to the Fantasy Focus YouTube channel. Once again, I'm Sky with my man Bob. We're going to make this a quick video on Jonathan Taylor specifically. Bob, break down the 2020, and I'll look at the future here. 2021, excuse me, and I'll look at the future in 2022.
So if you listen to our podcast yesterday, me and Buck kind of went through how to find steals in your fantasy football draft, and we had a complete list. We're talking today about Jonathan Taylor, of course, but we had a full breakdown of most of these players yesterday, so make sure you're checking them out, and make sure you're checking out our episodes the rest of the way. But here's the list of the guys that either exceeded on a points per game basis their ADP by position, or overall they exceeded it. So today's, of course, is the crown jewel probably of this, and that's Jonathan Taylor. And JT, when you look at his positional ADP, 8.5, of course, and then outside of that, he finishes RB2 in points per game and RB1 overall. So what we really want to do today is take a look at, yes, hindsight's 2020. We know that he was the best RB in fantasy, but we want to take a look at preseason 2021 to see what factors we could have looked at to see what was going to happen with Jonathan Taylor. So I want to just talk some numbers first about JT before we get into all that. The first thing is, one of the hesitancies of him was Marlon Mack. And early on in the season, we saw that kind of come into fruition. Marlon Mack was involved. Nahim Hines had his role, and he was only playing about 50% of snaps. So weeks 1 through 4, he averaged 50% of snaps, 17.3 touches, which is great, but he only had 11.8 points per game. Well, sure enough, they got done with the Marlon Mack situation. Weeks 5 through 18, JT averaged 23.3 touches, 23.9 points per game, and 76% of snaps. Now, the Marlon Mack situation was kind of unique. We'd never seen a 1,000-yard back rusher that had 2 really good seasons get hurt and then come back the following year and be supplanted. We never really saw this scenario come back. Either those guys move on to another team, they don't come back, or whatever. But there are some things that I want to talk about first that made JT that we should have kind of been higher on than usual. And the first, let's talk about Frank Wright. Now, Frank Wright has a history of leaning on younger backs. Brandon Oliver from his days with the San Diego Chargers, Melvin Gordon in their rookie seasons earned the starting job, not to begin the year, but early on in the season, and they ended up finishing strong in the second half. On top of that, Marlon Mack himself, when Frank Wright took over the job in 2018, Marlon Mack was coming into his second season. He gave Marlon Mack, the younger back, that job. So there was plenty of opportunities to see younger backs getting the opportunities under Frank Wright. Those running backs averaged 17.8 touches per game. So we saw history of younger backs, him leaning on those backs, but also they all not necessarily getting those starting jobs right away, which we kind of didn't know about Marlon Mack, but later on in the season, they all earned it. On top of that, JT's final 7 games of 2020, I mean, we knew they were historic. We tried to make excuses, the softer schedule, but when we're talking about historic, like insane numbers, we're talking about over 20 points per game. The final 7 games of 2020, 22 points per game, 22.3 touches. So we saw the history of the coach. We saw the production in the second half of 2020, And then on top of that, they bring in Carson Wentz, so they had somewhat of competent quarterback play. I understand Carson Wentz isn't the greatest quarterback, but he was average. And then they, on top of all this, they had the number 2 PFF preseason offensive line grade. So the offensive line, the history of the coaching staff, the production in the second half of 2020, the writing was kind of on the wall. I know personally, I never really gave Jonathan Taylor. I wasn't high or low on him. I just kind of didn't know to think about Marlon Mack. I didn't know what to think. But I think with the more we dive into this stuff, it kind of gives us more of an understanding of how he became the league winner he was. So, Sky, just give us a quick kind of your thoughts overall about JT's season and then maybe his 2022 outlook for next year.
I just have to eat crow on this one. And it seems so silly now because you're like, how the hell do you fade Jonathan Taylor, who outside of Derrick Henry was the best running back in fantasy football? And a lot of those question marks you just brought up, I took very seriously. He had an injury coming in. He had a quad groin injury, which David Montgomery had 2 years ago. We worried about it. He came out and balled out for a top 5 performance as well. So maybe that's not something to be so concerned about anymore. But let's not forget, Quentin Nelson also was injured. The offensive line was injured. They have a new quarterback. Phillip Rivers is not the check down, or Carson Wentz is not the check down guy like Rivers is, which you've mentioned. All of these, Marlon Mack and Nahim Hines, whatever. All of those things I had concern because Jonathan Taylor was going as a top 8 pick. I faded him back closer to like the end of the first round, beginning of the second round. Therefore, of course, I didn't really draft Jonathan Taylor anywhere because I didn't pick him ahead of guys like, Kamara, Cook, even Kelsey in a couple leagues, Adams for sure. And then of course, CMC and that was a huge issue for me coming into it, which was a big problem. And people who are frustrated about Jonathan Taylor had my mindset. You gave up on him early, you passed up on him, you were too late, and then you certainly couldn't trade for him once he went nuclear. People who are stoked on it obviously went for it. It worked out. They had to wait a couple weeks, and then boom, they struck gold. So, a quick comp, and then I'll move on to kind of 2022 here. A quick comp for me, which seems pretty easy, is Naji Harris, right? Rookie year, got a lot of work. Najee got a lot more work than Jonathan Taylor his rookie year, obviously. But, you don't think of him as a pass catching back, but he can catch the ball. Naji Harris led the NFL running backs in targets and receptions, right? He has a receiving floor or floor and ceiling that Jonathan Taylor just doesn't have. Similar ability, right? Similar body makeup, similar ability to score touchdowns. We'll see what the offense does in Pittsburgh, but nobody was crazy about the Colts offense this year either. And Jonathan Taylor was able to spring some huge touchdowns. So really it comes down to me, like the comp this year and the guy that I'm all in on and was last year, you can see it behind me, is Naji Harris. That's my guy. Looking back last year though, again, and kind of morphing last year into this year's draft season, the biggest question for Jonathan Taylor for everybody is, can he repeat? Can he be the number 1 running back in fantasy football? And Bob, there's no reason to knock Jonathan Taylor. There's no reason to say that he personally couldn't repeat. There's no reason to say that he shouldn't be the number 1 running back really in all formats. Maybe you can slice him in with CMC if you believe in it in full PPR, but the history tells me that I'm concerned about it. Now, he is clearly a top 3 running back off the board, no matter how you slice it. For me, I mentioned on a previous episode, it's CMC, it's Jonathan Taylor, and it's Dalvin Cook. For me right now, heading into 2022, we'll see what happens with injuries and health and everybody else. Maybe Alvin Kamara comes back in the mix. Maybe he's out. We don't know. So the biggest issue is, can Jonathan Taylor repeat? Well, Derrick Henry last year played 8 games, okay? Less than half a season because now we have 17. Henry was on pace for 386 PPR fantasy points, which would have been, if he played a whole season, averaged out, would have been 26 more fantasy points than Jonathan Taylor in PPR. That's more than a full game average. Derrick Henry would have been. Jonathan Taylor would have had an incredible season and been second. CMC got hurt. We know that historically, if CMC's healthy, he's a top 5 back in points per game. He's a top 2 back overall when he can stay healthy. He's been hurt the last 2 years. Jonathan Taylor was 21st in targets, 19th in receptions. Those are concerns for me. Again, you don't have the receiving floor that running backs seem to need outside of this year to be the number 1 running back, and I think Naji Harris has that. So a little bit of hesitation. Obviously, Bob, we like to turn the dial when we can. I got a couple of your OG favorites in this list. I want to mention quickly before I turn it back to you here, just something to chew on when you're looking at 2022. I'm not saying don't draft Jonathan Taylor first or top 2 or top 3. but just listen to this list and try to remember these guys if you've been playing for the last 20 years in fantasy football. Since 2003, 18 seasons, there has not been a repeat RB1 in PPR formats. No running back in PPR since 2003 has repeated the second year, and nobody has even done it twice overall since 2003, other than CMC, who tied Saquon in both formats in 2018. It was a running back one in 2019. I'll blast this list and I'll get your feedback on this. 2003, RB1 in PPR, Priest Holmes. 2004, Tiki Barber. 05, Sean Alexander. 06, LaDainian Tomlinson. Best season ever until CMC a couple years ago, and Derrick Henry. Brian Westbrook in 07, D'Angelo Williams in 08, Chris Johnson in 09, your boy Arian Foster in 10, Ray Rice in 11, Adrian Peterson in 12 for the MVP, Jamal Charles in 13, Le'Veon Bell in 14, Devonta Freeman in 15, David Johnson in 16, Todd Gurley in 17, Saquon in 18, CMC in 19, Kamara in 20, JT last year. Unfortunately, Bob, as much as I want to buy into this kid, I love this kid. History tells me he's not going to repeat as the number one running back. And when you're talking about the cream of the crop, it matters. If you have the one or two running back in a single quarterback league, you're going JT or you're going Henry or, Cook or CMC or whatever. You really got to play your cards. For me, I'm going to have a tough time going all in because of the history, but this kid is very special. We'll see what happens with Carson Wentz.
Right. It's the quarterback's going to matter a little bit here, but I think really it's just understanding that take another step to evaluate the history of the coach. Like some coaches lean on their veterans, some coaches don't. Frank Wright did show that he is willing to take the younger guy. The other thing too is Nahim Hines. Nahim Hines was not much of a factor this year. He was not as involved. He went from 76 down to the low 50s in targets, and JT actually saw a little bump in targets up to 51. So it looks like that Nahim Hines didn't have as much of a prevalent role. And if you actually, and I wanted to just take a look at this too while we're on air, it's just that when you're looking at the final games of 2020, you start noticing that he is being used less than Nahim Hines. And that's when Jonathan Taylor's going off. So I think that's part of it as well. I thought that Nahim Hines wasn't as prevalent either. I guess my question then comes, how can we look? I think we should not completely turn our noses up to these guys who have historic sample sizes, even if they're 5 to 7 games down the stretch. They have to be a part of the process. We have to evaluate those guys under a bigger microscope. Like, we can't just say, oh, JT, he might be okay. Like, I honestly will admit, because I don't mean to blame our thing, but what we did is we split up the teams for AFC North, AFC South. You took 2 teams. I actually didn't do the Colts. So it kind of left me, I actually didn't do enough research on JT. I'll admit that right now. And maybe if I did more of a deeper dive, I would have noticed some of this stuff. But, I think overall we shouldn't ignore. So let's say 2022 outlook. It sounds like we kind of have an idea. Consensus top 3 pick, probably the first one. But is there guys out there that could? So Rashad Penny is an example of a guy who led the NFL in points per game the last 5 weeks. Devin Singletary had big games down the stretch. Could these guys build on these really strong end of seasons? Another guy like Leonard Fournette 2 years ago, playoff Lenny, built on that. So any of these guys kind of spark your interest as maybe not a JT level player, but can they build off those strong down the stretches for next season?
Yeah, David Montgomery I might throw in there too. He got injured. He was pretty much hurt all season this year, but he ended 2020 extremely hot as well, and then kind of faded this year because he was injured and the Bears offense sputtered and everything else. So he's probably in the bottom of that list there, but I think he's another guy that could again pop off and reemerge. Devin Singletary, I was very impressed with, obviously, but Brian Daboll's moved on to your Giants. I don't know what they're going to have in Buffalo with kind of a shakeup there. Does Zach Moss return? Are they going to draft anybody else, bring in a free agent? I like Singletary a lot, and he was impressive, but I'm not so sure about him. Javonte Williams, I know the hype's real, but if Melvin Gordon's still there, I just don't think that'll happen. For me, again, I mentioned Naji Harris earlier. I'll stick by that one, but I think you brought up, Rashad Penny jumps off the map for sure for me. I mentioned in our previous episode when we were talking about running back busts, I was concerned about Chris Carson and a neck injury. Even if he comes back healthy, like Do the Seahawks, lean to him, or is this kid Penny finally, after all these years, healthy? Pete Carroll wants him to be the guy. Do they do a 50-50? I doubt it. I think Rashad Penny's going to run him out of the room, and if he does, he could be the guy in the second half. And let's be clear here. Jonathan Taylor was not Jonathan Taylor all season long, right? Like Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, these guys were not explosive, unbelievable talents right away out of the gate. It took them 4-6 weeks. So you don't have to be that guy every single week to be the number one or top 5 pick. And I think a guy like Javonte could take the job and run with it. Penny could take the job and run with it. Maybe Singletary can too. Naji Harris, though, in my opinion, is the guy that's going to have all the work from day one, pass catching work. And, as long as they have a competent quarterback, I think that offense is going to be fine. So Najee is my guy for this list, but I do like the other names you threw out.
Well, I think Naji Harris, we have to see what they do with the offensive line because they're not going to have a top half of the league line. And Naji, listen, he kind of leveled off towards the second half of the year because he was by far leading the NFL in running back targets the first half of the season. He had a 21 target game in that. So, over the second half, he was like in a low-end RB1. So I think the quarterback matters. What they do with the offensive line matters. But for JT specifically today, when we're looking at this, do they have a top 10 offensive line? Do they have an innovative coach? Do they have a decent quarterback? And are they in a system that has bell cows? I think we have to look at all those factors. And hopefully we do find those guys for next year. But Sky, why don't you close us out maybe and talk to the people about our next episode coming out later today?
As of right now, Bob, is Jonathan Taylor your number one running back?
Yes.
Okay. You're half PPR. I'm full PPR. I lean CMC if he's healthy, but I love, of course, me some Jonathan Taylor. All right, y'all. We'll keep the rest of these a little bit quicker here. We got Austin Eckler coming up next. Another phenomenal season, easily his career year. Finally scored a bunch of those touchdowns we love. My boy Jay Herbie dishing off. We love the Chargers there down south. So we got Austin Eckler coming up this evening. Come back to us right here on YouTube, Fantasy Focus channel. You can find us on Twitch, Twitter, and Facebook as well. This episode and all episodes of the TCK Pod have been brought to you by the Believe Podcast Network and Bet Online AG. Bob and I will be back with you this evening for Austin Eckler. Hit that bell, hit the subscribe. We'll catch you next time.